Welcome to Africa Today TV's Leading Voices. I'm Tara Wall. Africa is said to have the fastest growing economy of any continent over the next 5 years, and 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies will be African, according to reports. With that in mind, the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus membership is looking to harness economic opportunities associated with that growth. Joining me is a leading voice on U.S.-Africa relations, co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus's Africa Task Force and ranking member of the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Africa, California Congresswoman Karen Bass. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Sure. Well, first, for those who aren't familiar with you or the CBC, frankly, tell us a little bit about the Congressional Black Caucus and the goals of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Sure. Well, you know, the Black Caucus is known as the conscience of the Congress. There's over 43 members now. The caucus is 40 years old, and we represent districts all over the country and focus on a variety of different issues. A couple of issues I focus on, of course, you mentioned Africa. I also focus on our nation's child welfare system. And members of the Congressional Black Caucus serve on just about every committee and in leadership positions throughout the Democratic Party, as well as the House of Representatives, and one member of the Senate.
That's right,
Cory Booker.
Well, and you've really taken up the issue of U.S.-Africa relations. You said, I think I've read, you said that you wanted to really transform the way we think about Africa. As your work as co-chair of the CBC Africa Task Force and the subcommittee, what does that mean? What does that entail? And what do you mean when you say transform? What does that mean?
Absolutely. Well, I think that, frankly, our nation is behind. Many other countries around the world recognize how you opened the show. 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies on the planet are on the continent of Africa. I think within the U.S., we don't understand that Africa, first of all, is a continent. 54 countries.
Some people still don't know that, even some politicians.
You can take the 48 continental United States and put it on the continent of Africa 3 times. And so beginning to change how we view Africa, because up until now, we view Africa as a famine, a war, and a disease, as opposed to an economic engine for the planet. China, Brazil, Turkey, many other countries around recognize this fact. And so I want us to begin to look at Africa not as a nation always in need of our aid, but as an equal partner that we need to engage in a trade relationship with.
A thriving, growing economy, number of economies, frankly, that we should be doing business with.
And most of the countries on the continent are peaceful. Yes, they are poor. Yes, they are still suffering from a couple of centuries of colonialism. But if you think about the continent of Africa, it's only been a post-colonial continent for for about 50 years. If we look at our democracy is over 230 years old. So when we look at some of the instability on the continent of Africa, understand that it's new societies. It took our country many years through several wars, internal and external, before we achieved the stability and peace to grow as the nation that we are today.
And why do you think, why do you think that there is this misperception, if you will? Why do you think that, and maybe media, has some responsibility here too, and it's one of the reasons why we have this network, but why do you believe there's this image, this pervasive image of the famine and the wars and the drought of Africa, as opposed to having, or at least in addition to having, some of the great stories and some of the other economic areas of growth and opportunity on this continent?
Well, I think our media coverage is, if it bleeds, it leads. But if you think about it, even with that point of view, there's very little coverage about Africa, period. So, for example, President Obama, first time in U.S. history, host over 47 presidents from the continent of Africa here in Washington, D.C. for a week. Very little press coverage. The whole focus of the first ever U.S.-African summit was to focus on economic development, trade, and viewing the continent from a different point of view. So that's one issue. The other issue is in general, our education system, which really doesn't do very well when it comes to foreign relations. And the late night comedians, how many times do they go around and ask people questions, and folks think that, Ghana is a Caribbean island. I mean, so in general, I think as a nation, we are weak when it comes to international relations. and then I think Africa then suffers greatly because of that.
Yeah, and so there's an educational process too that
Right.
has to happen, that has to take place. You said a top priority for you is the African Growth and Opportunities Act. So what is that all about? What does that
Sure.
entail?
That is our primary vehicle from which we trade with the continent. So essentially, and the short version is called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, is due to expire next year. And essentially what it is that it allows for African nations, if they meet certain criteria, to trade with the United States tariff-free. So they don't have any tariffs. But when you are talking about businesses on the continent of Africa, many of those businesses benefit U.S. jobs. So for example, in the apparel industry, if you go to the Gap, you might be buying fabrics that were made in Africa or pieces of clothing. The oil industry, there's a lot of industries in our country that we don't realize originate on the continent of Africa. Now, having said that, the African Growth and Opportunity Act is due to be renewed at the end of next year. So the focus of my work is to make sure that it is renewed in a timely fashion.
And so when you say folks that essentially, qualify for this, what are some of the qualifications, stipulations of this act? And in other words, how people can get involved and how they qualify?
Sure. Well, one of the things is it has to be a stable government. So,
Sure.
For example, some countries were kicked out of AGOA because there was a coup or something like that. But one of the biggest challenges of the continent, and one of the reasons why many countries can't qualify, is because they don't have the infrastructure within their country. So for example, they might have difficulty transporting certain products. The other issue is them reaching U.S. standards. So we have very high standards, very high regulations for safety, for protection of our consumers. And so some African countries, because their economies are relatively new, have difficulty achieving our standards. And then another big issue is because there are so many countries, some of the countries' businesses cannot do business to the scale in which to do business with
Sure.
a country like the United States.
And that takes some time. I'm also assuming too that this is where some of these U.S. partnerships also come in to help where there needs to be more development in some of these countries. And I'm sure that's some of what came out of the U.S.-Africa Summit, which we'll talk about. But I guess are there provisions within the act that help that, or is that something else that's also being done in tandem with AGOA?
That is an excellent question, and we're trying to figure that out now. But I will tell you how I believe it's going to happen. I believe that the African Growth and Opportunity Act will be reauthorized that will simply allow for the continuation of exports without tariffs. Having said that, I also believe that there's going to be a series of pieces of legislation that are companions to AGOA
Sure.
that will address issues like you raised. The president has his own initiatives. One of which is called Power Africa. One of the big infrastructure problems to address on the continent is the fact that 2/3 of the continent does not have electricity.
Sure.
So Power Africa is the promotion of a public-private partnership to help the continent develop that infrastructure. And we have done in Congress companion legislation so that once President Obama leaves, it will be a permanent feature of U.S.-Africa relations.
And I believe I read about, I don't know that this is, I'm not sure if this is something you signed on with or your bill, but the Energize Africa Act, that was also bipartisan legislation
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
That addresses electricity issues and developing some of these countries.
Now in the House, we call it Electrify Africa.
Okay, this is the Senate, right?
This
So
is the
was
Senate version, yes.
Is the Energize Africa
And
Act.
Chairman Ed Royce is the leader in the House, and absolutely he was one of the key partners that I worked with to make sure it passed the House. And the Senate version now, hopefully we will be able to put a bill on the president's desk before the end of the year.
And so we're in a week right now where the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, has what it's called the Congressional Black Caucus Week, for those that aren't aware of it. But as part of this week as well, you are spearheading what's called a brain trust, Africa Brain Trust, of leaders, African leaders, ambassadors, USAID. Talk a little bit about that and the purpose of that. This is an annual event that you have at CBC, correct?
Yes, it absolutely is. And this year what we're focusing on is really a look back at the summit. So the summit happened, and it was a couple of months ago, and now we are compiling academics, scholars, former ambassadors, representatives of organizations such as the Brookings Institute, the Wilson Center, to all come back and tell us their reflections on what they thought of the summit.
So yeah, I'll just pick up right where you left off there. Let's talk a little bit about the U.S.-Africa Summit. We covered that here on our network as well. First and foremost, going into the U.S.-Africa Summit, what were your thoughts about why it should be done, why it's being done now? There was some criticism that it's it happens late in the president's administration, but given that, do you think it was a good? It looked like it was a good rounded panel of discussion that took place. Tell us what you thought going in, and then your reflections looking back at what needs to happen going forward.
Well, it was a very exciting week to be in Washington, D.C., and actually our criticism wasn't so much that it was late in his administration, but that we wished it would have happened when Congress was in session, and so we weren't here. And however, many members of Congress did stay around and were involved in it. But it was an exciting time. So a couple of things that happened within the House of Representatives and the Senate. We had a congressional reception and we welcomed the heads of state.
Sure. Which was historic in itself.
Absolutely, never happened before.
That many heads of state in the D.C. area.
Exactly, and there were official activities that the president was involved in. On the second day, there was the CEO forum, and so there were over 300 CEOs from Africa as well as the United States that participated in a meeting with the heads of state. Then there was the formal summit that took place with the president on Wednesday. Right. But in addition, there were over 100 activities that took place all over the city, different organizations that put on events and activities. So it was very exciting.
So when you look at the schedule of what took place, like you said, there were a number of conversations. There were panels that focused on youth and young people, right, and technology, economic growth and opportunity, some of the infrastructure issues you mentioned. Also, safety and security issues were among those that were on the panel. Going forward, what would you like to, what would you like to have seen come out of the summit, and where do you think we need to go given all that took place during that week?
And actually, let me mention that the week before the summit, the president also hosted an initiative that he has led on, which is called the Young African Leaders Initiative. So there were 500 leaders from around the country representing every country on the continent, and they were here for a week. That makes a statement in and of itself. The fact that he met with the young people the week before the heads of state were here.
I recall that.
So in terms of what should come out of it, one, it is the continuation of working with that next generation of leaders, absolutely. And then it is also the implementation of many of the agreements that were reached during the three-day summit. Sure. And so some of them involved businesses, some of them involved governance, and some of them involved technical assistance, because going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, one of the biggest things that is needed on the continent is the technical assistance, so how they can do business with not just our country, but also other developed countries around the world in Europe.
Yeah, and those young people are really, obviously, they're going to be the engines that also help to drive this, particularly in this new age of social media and all the things that are happening at such a rapid rate. I mean, I think that they're going to also, they're really at the cusp of some of the things that can happen for these countries, I think.
Right.
And so that's important as well. Speaking of that, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the role Africans and African immigrants play here in America, yes, and the importance of them and U.S.-Africa relations. In your view, I mean, you do a lot of work with women and with the diaspora here in the D.C. area. Tell us, in your view, some of the importance of their roles in helping to have these countries thrive economically and thrive with trade relations in the U.S. What's the role of individuals here?
Well, you know, one thing that's interesting to note, when we talk about immigrant populations, African immigrants are the most educated immigrants in our country. One of the things that's been happening over the last 10 years is a reverse. You hear about the brain drain, immigrants, yes, coming over and then never leaving. Now you're having a reversal of that. Yes. So you're having many Africans return home. I've had the opportunity to visit many African countries, and I was in Ethiopia recently, and I met with a number of Ethiopian Americans who went back to Ethiopia and have opened up businesses. And I have seen that no matter what country I was in. I've seen Africans who come here, get educated, and return home. That's a very important role to play. Having said that, though, there are thousands of Africans that live here who are actively doing business with the continent. So I think they have a transformative role to play in U.S.-African relations because they can be role models. You know, of course, the multinational corporations are, not all of them, but many of them are involved in the continent. But we know the driver for jobs in our country are smaller businesses. And so when you're talking about the diaspora, you are talking about smaller businesses that are actively doing business on the continent.
And the work that you do with women, particular African immigrant women, has to do with building businesses, is that right?
Right, yes, it's called the African Women Entrepreneurial Project, and it's actually a project of the State Department of USAID. And that really works with African women on the continent. I have the honor, as being a member of Congress, of hosting many delegations of women, African women, who come over to learn from the United States. And many of them are business women, and some of them are elected officials, are aspiring elected officials, head of non-governmental organizations. And so women's leadership, I think everybody recognizes, is absolutely crucial for the development of the continent.
That's awesome. And speaking, along the same lines of, we hear about the immigration issue and immigration reform so much nowadays here in the U.S. But you don't hear. I think people forget that there are African immigrants, and to your point, the most educated. But when we forget when we're talking about immigrants, there are a whole host of immigrants that fall under that umbrella, not just with Hispanic immigrants, but African immigrants. Can you speak to that a little bit and the importance of the whole issue around immigration and how that applies to African immigrants in particular?
Well, one of the things that we have to recognize in our country is that our immigration policies have been pretty discriminatory. And when it comes to immigrants from Africa, we limit the numbers very severely. And so one of the things that was happening, because right now nothing is happening in terms of immigration reform.
That's right.
But what was
it's been put on the back
happening,
burner right now.
exactly, what was happening during the conversations is that we had to be very careful. It's a perfect example of the role of the Congressional Black Caucus, by the way, because there was some effort to kind of pit groups against each other. And so there is a program that's called diversity visas, which is the primary vehicle in which Africans come to the United States. And so there was an effort to eliminate that category of visas.
Wow.
So we already really restrict the number of Africans that come to the country. And so if you were to eliminate the diversity visas, you would really severely cut African immigration.
What was the argument? I'm sure there was some argument around that, but
yes, there was. It was that it wasn't needed anymore. But we did fight hard to make sure that, and actually, eventually, it might be eliminated. But what replaces it would not restrict the Africans that are able to come into the country.
And it's my understanding that the U.S. is the second largest country outside of Brazil where African immigrants immigrate to. So I mean, it's we get a good influx of African immigrants. I think it's important in the whole scope of the immigration debate, as you mentioned. I do want to talk also a little bit about you touched on your visits to Africa, to several countries, I believe you said in Africa, but tell us about some of the places that you visited, Ethiopia and others, and how that's really impacted you with the work that you do and why it's really propelled you to move forward in this area.
Well, it's very exciting. I mean, the continent is so diverse. If you think about 54 countries and imagining the hundreds and thousands of cultures and languages that are there, and the different status. So I have seen countries that are prospering and doing well, and I've also seen countries that are having major challenges of governance, challenges of violence. But what has been inspiring to me is the potential, and of course the resilience of the population and the welcoming. Africans really want to do business with the United States. Everybody hears about China in Africa, and obviously China has a role to play. Some of it is positive, some of it is not, but the Africans want to have much more interaction with the United States, and that's very exciting to me.
Do you think there's more favoritism in some ways, or that Africans even see more favoritism in some ways to China as opposed to Africa?
Yes, absolutely.
By the United States?
Well, the situation is really different. And so, for example, in China, the government owns major industries. That doesn't happen in the United States. So it's a lot easier for the Chinese to go over and hand a $2-3 billion check. I mean, I went and I visited the African Union, for example. The Chinese built the entire facility for free. So some of the ways that they do business is because of their economic structure that is very different than ours. And, you know, over the years, we've not always had the best history with some of the African countries. And the Chinese, you know, they've had a longer, closer relationship with. But the African countries that I have interacted with, of course they want to continue their relationship with China, but they very much want to expand their relationship with the United States.
A couple of issues I do want to touch on before we wrap. So there obviously, you know, the economic, the trade, I think are clearly the biggest drivers of your work and what you do. But there certainly are security and health issues that face and plague some of these countries in Africa. You did issue a statement in support of bipartisan legislation that led to the administration dispersing or looking to disperse funds to combat Ebola in West Africa.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, that is a real crisis that the entire world needs to become involved in. And I understand the president today at the United Nations, you know, addressed the issue to rally support. It is primarily affecting 3 countries. But one of my big concerns about the Ebola crisis is that some of these countries are are peaceful, but pretty recent they had civil wars. So in Liberia and Sierra Leone, for example. So I want to make sure that they don't fall back into a conflict situation while they're trying to address a health crisis. And so I think when it's all said and done, we're going to be very proud of the United States response. The president has been very aggressive, bipartisan, bicameral support within Congress. He's moved ahead, though, and essentially restructured resources that they already had that they didn't need our authorization for. But I have no doubt that when Congress does come back to session, you will see us move forward in a bipartisan way again.
And what are your concerns, if any, about the threats, the health threats posed by Ebola itself and the spread of that? You believe it's in a containment, or
No, it has not been contained yet. I will tell you what I am worried about and what I'm not worried about. I am not worried about Ebola coming to the United States. You know, one of the reasons why Ebola is so devastating is because these are countries that have very fragile, very weak health systems to begin with. That is not the case in this country. But it hasn't been contained yet. And I do believe with what the president has called for, as well as rallying the other countries, they will be able to contain it, but that has not happened yet. So, for example, I recently talked with the president of Liberia, President Sirleaf Johnson, and one of the things she said to me is that she said, Congresswoman, you have to realize that we have put all of our efforts on Ebola, which means if you have a car accident or break your leg in some other area, you are going to be in a major problem.
Right,
because
and I've read a lot about that, about how some of these, I mean, you know, God forbid, I read about a gentleman that actually had an operation and that had to be put on hold because the priority right now are Ebola patients.
They do not have the healthcare workers and they don't have the healthcare infrastructure. So one of the things that our military is doing, the president ordered, I think it was 3,000 troops to go over to Liberia and the other countries. One of the things they're going to be doing is constructing hospitals, because, you know, our military can move into logistical action in ways that other governmental entities can't do. And so they're going to be setting up the healthcare system, but actually not just for the Ebola patients, but to help the overall healthcare system in Liberia.
Sure. And then speaking to military and safety and security, obviously right now we're here in the U.S., we see the terrorist situations ramping up across, you know, really in other countries all over. But given what happened recently with, you know, Boko Haram,
Right.
and some of these just really fringe terrorist organizations, what are your concerns about safety and security in some of these countries in Africa, and how do we as a country help to either help by you know, being there, providing resources, or help to support in situations like Boko Haram where just an assist is needed? What is your view on that and how we play a role in those situations?
You are absolutely right. That is a major threat, and Boko Haram's kidnapping of the 200 girls was just absolutely horrendous. However, I will tell you that's when it came to our attention. Boko Haram had been operating for a number of years, and what they were doing is they were going into dormitories and killing young men and boys. So this is a situation that has gone on for a while. After the girls were kidnapped, though, the United States did step up and provide technical assistance to the Nigerians. But we do have to be concerned about the destabilization taking place in other parts of the world can also destabilize African countries. When Gaddafi fell in Libya, for example, that directly led to a coup in Mali. So some of these situations are interconnected. That's also where the security concerns in the United States comes into play. Be people traveling back and forth, and we've heard that about ISIL. We've heard that about Americans, and we suspect there might even be 100 Americans or so who are over there fighting.
So should
with
we
ISIL.
be doing more, in your opinion, or do you think we're doing all that our role should be in these situations?
I do think
generally speaking,
I think what we're doing is fine. However, we have to get to the root causes as to why you have a Boko Haram or an ISIL to begin with. Those kind of situations happen when you have a population that is disaffected, disconnected, and sees no other alternatives. One of the things I found in traveling to African countries and looking into the security situation, you have these young men who are involved in these militaries because that's the only way they eat. They associate participating in these groups with an income. So if you can replace that income with a legitimate, productive job, you are going to be able to then get rid of the root causes as to why these young people are attracted to this to begin with.
Sure. Well, I don't want to leave on a down note, so I want to, with your final question, with our final question, I just want you to talk a little bit more about the legacy you hope to leave as a member of Congress, as well as an engaged citizen when it comes to U.S.-Africa relations and kind of the way forward for you and your vision going forward, what you'd like to leave with our viewers.
Well, I would love to leave Congress with the idea that I contributed to a complete change in how we view the continent. That I would leave Congress and we would view the continent of Africa in the same way we view Europe. We don't think of Europe as a stepchild. We don't think of Europe as a continent that needs us for everything. We think of Europe as a continent that is equal to us, that we have a trade relationship with, and there's mutual respect and mutual benefit.
And how long do you think it's going to take to get us
Next
there?
year.
It'll take a little while, right?
It will.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure having you here. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. And once again, I would like to thank my guest representing California's 37th Congressional District, Congresswoman Karen Bass, for her insight and leadership concerning U.S.-Africa relations. Until next time, I'm Tara Wall for Africa Today TV's Leading Voices.